Under the amber glow of the cabin lights, the hum of engines blended with the soft rustle of silk dresses and leather seats, a chorus of luxury meant to lull the travelers of Flight 789 into a sense of superiority and ease. Yet hidden in the aisle, struggling with an oversized bag and a child's unicorn backpack, was a man who did not belong, at least not to the eyes trained to measure worth by labels and polished shoes. His hands, broad and steady, fumbled with a safety harness that refused to yield, and in that quiet battle every gaze in business class turned him into a spectacle. They saw inconvenience, they saw clumsiness. But they did not see the quiet storm of devotion in his eyes, the kind of love that could carry the weight of worlds. The little girl by his side leaned forward toward the oval window, curls bouncing as she pressed her nose against the glass, her laughter ringing like silver bells across the hushed compartment. She whispered questions only her father could answer, and he bent low, patience carved into every line of his face, speaking to her as if the cabin, the strangers, the judgments had all vanished. There was tenderness there, healing, steady, whole, the kind of tenderness that could silence storms and soothe wounded hearts. She clutched a sketchbook filled with fighter jets sketched in a child's hand, each page annotated with careful notes, evidence of countless evenings spent learning from him, of a bond that needed no translation. A woman in crimson silk watched with a gaze sharpened by years of boardroom conquests. Astrid Sterling, the kind of name spoken in conference halls with reverence or fear, rested her manicured fingers on the armrest, lips curved with amusement that cut like glass. To her, business class was sacred ground, a sanctuary for the powerful, the polished, the untouchable. And in her eyes, this man, his jacket plain, his sneakers worn, his entire presence unremarkable, was a trespasser. When her voice drifted across the aisle, laced with mockery, it drew chuckles from men in tailored suits, their laughter a soft chorus of approval. Nathan Hayes, for that was the name of the man with the unicorn backpack, said nothing. His jaw tightened, the only sign of the years of discipline that had taught him restraint. The child noticed the whispers, the laughter, her small hand slipping into his as she asked why people were laughing. He knelt to her level, his voice soft, soothing, like a warm river that carried away fear. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Some people just need to make noise. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." And in those words lay an entire universe of resilience. He opened a book, their ritual, their healing, a story of an airplane that soared higher because it carried not the heaviest engines but the biggest heart. She giggled, leaning against him, while champagne glasses sparkled in hands too proud to notice that true wealth was unfolding right before them. The plane surged forward, the sky claiming its dominion, and the world outside became clouds and light. Nathan declined champagne, ordering apple juice for the girl, who colored clouds around her jets with a seriousness only children possess. Astrid sipped her Dom Perignon, still amused, still judging, her thoughts already moving toward the empire waiting in London. Yet she stole glances when she thought no one noticed, drawn in by something she did not understand, something she had not felt in years. It was then the cabin shuddered. A tremor at first, then a violent jolt that sent glasses shattering, hearts leaping, and laughter dying in throats. Lights flickered, shadows danced, and the sky outside grew teeth. A smell like burning wires cut the air, and the calm rhythm of travel fractured into panic. Somewhere at the front, a voice carried urgency. steady yet edged with fear. "Are there any pilots on board? Any at all?" Silence followed, a silence so heavy it pressed against lungs and froze pulses. And in that silence, Nathan's world shifted. The promise he had made on a hospital bed, whispered into the fading breath of the woman he once loved, weighed against the desperate trust in his daughter's eyes. His hands shook only once before they stilled. He reached for the wallet worn by years, fingers brushing over the card that no longer had use but still held meaning. Lieutenant Colonel. Fighter pilot. Hours in the sky. Battles fought. Lives saved. His daughter's hand clutched his as the plane groaned, and her voice, steady, innocent, healing in its purity, rose above the chaos. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" He kissed her hair, inhaling the sweetness of strawberry shampoo, and stood. The man mocked for his worn sneakers now walked with a stride honed by storms fiercer than turbulence, his presence filling the aisle with a gravity no title, no fortune, no empire could imitate. He handed the attendant his card, the truth of who he was written in ink and years of service. "That's my daddy," the little girl said softly, but the pride in her voice reached every corner of the trembling cabin. Eyes turned, and among them Astrid Sterling's world tilted. The man she had dismissed, belittled, quietly stepped into a role greater than any she had ever claimed. And as he disappeared into the cockpit, her champagne-laced certainty crumbled, replaced by something raw, unfamiliar, and unbidden. Respect, awe, and perhaps the fragile, flickering spark of something more. And so began a journey where storms outside the plane mirrored storms within hearts, where arrogance collided with humility, and where, amidst the roar of engines and the silence of unspoken fears, love began to weave itself into the cracks left by judgment. A love not of glittering surfaces, but of steady devotion, healing warmth, and the kind of courage that turns strangers into something infinitely closer. If these words stir something gentle yet powerful in your heart, let it breathe. Leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, or subscribe to join the unfolding chapters of a story where healing meets romance, and where hearts discover that true flight begins not with wings, but with love. The storm passed into memory only as fragile calm returned, but the ripples it left behind remained visible in every eye. Business class, once a theatre of wealth and composure, now felt like a room stripped bare of its illusions. Passengers who had chuckled before sat in humbled silence, their laughter broken by the sound of fear that had clawed their throats minutes earlier. And in the centre of it, Astrid Sterling sat motionless, fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, though she had forgotten to drink. She had watched him rise, had seen the man mocked for his awkward luggage step forward as if summoned by destiny itself. She told herself it didn't matter, that his calm resolve meant nothing to her life, but her pulse betrayed her, quickening at the memory of his stride and the way his daughter's voice echoed like a hymn across the fractured quiet. "That's my daddy." The cabin hummed with whispered speculation, curious eyes stealing glances toward the cockpit door where Nathan had vanished. For Astrid, those whispers turned inward. Her mind, always sharp and calculating, found itself unraveling in directions she could not control. She remembered her words, cutting, shallow, aimed like a dagger at the pride of a man she thought beneath her. And now she remembered his silence in reply, the gentleness with which he calmed his child instead of defending his own pride. Healing words spoken not for her benefit, but for the girl's. That restraint, that quiet dignity, began to gnaw at her. In a boardroom, silence was weakness. Here, silence had been strength. Her phone, buzzing with constant alerts for London, now lay forgotten in her bag. For the first time in years, her mind was not tethered to earnings reports or acquisition strategies. Instead, she was caught in a collision of worlds, hers, built on steel and glass and ambition, and his, built on bedtime stories, pink backpacks, and sacrifices she had not imagined. And though she fought it, something inside her shifted, a crack opening in the polished armor she had worn for so long. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Nathan's voice carried like a steady drumbeat through the intercom and radios. His commands, precise and calm, stitched order into chaos. Captain Collins relied on him as if they had flown together for years, trusting his instincts in storms where instruments faltered. Nathan's heart should have been racing, but years of combat had trained him to breathe into fear, to weave clarity out of noise. He spoke, he calculated, he guided, and all the while, at the back of his mind, he carried the memory of Olivia's hand, her trust, her healing presence that had given him the courage to step forward once again. Astrid's thoughts returned to that child. Olivia had not cried when the plane lurched, had not screamed like the others. She had drawn, had coloured skies and wings as if the fate of 200 passengers could be softened by a crayon. And perhaps in some way it had. Because the businessman beside her, trembling and panicked, had calmed under her innocent assurance. Astrid had watched as the girl offered gum, as if healing came not from wealth or wisdom, but from the sweetness of a child who believed utterly in her father. That faith had unsettled Astrid more than the turbulence. When had she last believed in anything? The minutes dragged into hours, every second heavy with the uncertainty of whether land would meet them or reject them. Astrid found herself staring at the cockpit door, willing it to open, needing to see his face again. Not because she admired his skill, though skill it was that had kept them alive thus far, but because she wanted to understand. How did a man endure mockery and not fight back? How did he carry grief and not harden into bitterness? How did he love so wholly, when love itself seemed to her a liability? Questions swirled, and though she had no answers, she felt them healing something brittle within her. The plane descended at last, breaking through clouds heavy with rain. Runway lights appeared like stars fallen to earth, guiding them toward salvation. Astrid's nails dug into her palms as metal wheels kissed wet tarmac with a thunderous bounce, then steadied into the miracle of survival. Around her, strangers wept, embraced, prayed. Astrid did none of these. She only sat frozen, her eyes locked on the cockpit door that would soon open, carrying with it the man who had held their fate in his hands. When Nathan emerged, Olivia ran into his arms, clinging to him with relief that melted the cabin into silence. Astrid's heart twisted. She saw not just a father, but a man defined by something she had long forgotten: grace. He spoke no triumphant words, claimed no glory, merely gathered his child and prepared to leave, as though saving 200 lives were nothing more than another act of love in a long line of them. Astrid stepped forward, almost against her own will. Her voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual polish, raw and uncertain. She apologized, not for the storm, not for the fear, but for herself, for the cruelty of her assumptions, for the blindness of her pride. Nathan looked at her, steady, unshaken, and answered with words so simple they pierced her more deeply than any rebuke could have. "You don't owe me anything, Mum. Anyone would have done the same." But she knew that was not true. She knew because she had watched a cabin full of powerful people remain silent while he alone had risen. The clash between their worlds, once sharp and merciless, now felt fragile, like a bridge forming in the air. And when Olivia tugged Astrid's sleeve with childlike innocence, inviting her to share a meal, the walls Astrid had built for years trembled under the weight of that simple, healing offer. Outside, the rain softened into mist, and the night air smelled of earth and redemption. Inside, Astrid Sterling's empire still glittered behind her, waiting in London with its demands and applause. But here, in the quiet aftermath, she stood at the edge of a choice she had never considered, that perhaps true wealth was not measured in victories won, but in hearts opened, in wounds healed, in love offered freely. And so the storm carried them into a new horizon, not one drawn on charts or flight plans, but one written in the fragile, unspoken space between a man, his daughter, and a woman who had just begun to remember what it meant to feel. The night seemed to stretch endlessly over the Atlantic, the memory of lightning still echoing in minds and bones, though the storm had finally loosened its grip. The aircraft rested on the runway, engines cooling, metal trembling, as if it too remembered the violence of the descent. Ambulances flashed against sheets of rain, their lights painting streaks of red and blue across tear-streaked faces inside the cabin. People clutched one another, laughter tangled with sobs, the sharp taste of fear still lingering in their throats. And in the midst of it all, Nathan carried Olivia as if she were spun glass, her head tucked against his shoulder, her tiny body breathing the steady rhythm of trust. He walked past applause, past grateful hands reaching out to touch him, his gaze fixed only on the exit, on the promise that had guided every decision, to keep his daughter safe. Astrid stood frozen in the aisle, watching him, her breath caught in the space between awe and regret. She had seen men rise to power through ruthless ambition, had watched competitors destroy each other for the sake of a number on a chart, but she had never witnessed power like this, power clothed in humility, anchored in love, steady as a lighthouse against the storm. His silence spoke louder than applause, his refusal of glory a revelation to someone who had built her world on chasing it. She felt a tightness in her chest, an ache she had not named in years, as though some hidden part of her, long buried beneath ambition, was stirring awake, longing for healing. Outside, rain softened to a gentle mist, wrapping the tarmac in silver. The passengers dispersed, their voices carrying fragments of the story that would soon travel further than the plane itself. Reporters gathered beyond the gates, cameras ready, but Nathan lowered his eyes, shifting Olivia's backpack on his shoulder, and slipped into the crowd as though he were invisible. Astrid followed at a distance, her heels striking the wet pavement, her heart battling itself with every step. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he had walked away from recognition, to tell him she had misjudged him, to say something, anything that might bridge the chasm between them. At the shuttle door, she finally found her voice. "Wait," she whispered, but the sound barely carried in the drizzle. He paused, turning with the patience of a man who had been called by fear, by duty, by countless voices in the past. His eyes met hers, deep and unguarded, and she faltered beneath their weight. She expected accusation, perhaps disdain, but there was none. Only quiet strength and a gentleness that unsettled her more than anger ever could. She stammered out her apology, her words raw, stripped of polish. "I judged you. I was wrong. And tonight you saved us all." Nathan adjusted Olivia in his arms, his gaze holding hers steady. "You don't owe me anything," he said simply. "I only did what I had to do, for her." His voice softened at the last word, carrying a warmth that healed even as it reminded Astrid of everything she had lost in pursuit of power. She had thought herself strong, yet in that moment she saw how hollow her strength was beside his, how brittle ambition seemed against the quiet resilience of love. It was Olivia, stirring sleepily, who bridged the silence. Her small hand reached toward Astrid's sleeve, tugging gently, her eyes blinking open with the innocence of someone who had not yet learned to close doors. "You can come to dinner with us," she murmured. "Daddy makes spaghetti. Mummy always said there's room for one more." The words, simple and sweet, carried the kind of healing that could undo years of solitude. Astrid's heart twisted painfully, for she could not remember the last time anyone had invited her with such uncalculated kindness. They found themselves later in a small restaurant near the hotel, its light plain and yellow against the rain-streaked windows. The tables were worn, the napkins folded paper, the menus lined with photographs. Yet there was something sacred in the ordinariness, something warm and grounding that Astrid had not known she was starving for. She sat across from Nathan and Olivia, and as the child animatedly explained how French fries could be used to demonstrate the lift of airplane wings, Astrid laughed, a sound genuine and unguarded, startling her with its softness. She had not heard herself laugh that way in years. Nathan shared stories carefully, painting glimpses of a life that was rich in ways money could never touch. He spoke of his late wife with a tenderness that did not sting of grief, but glowed with remembrance, each memory offered not as a wound, but as healing light. He cut Olivia's chicken fingers, listened intently to her chatter, his every gesture a quiet devotion that filled the space around them with warmth. Astrid watched, aching and mesmerized, realizing that what she had dismissed as weakness was, in truth, the strongest thing she had ever witnessed. Her phone vibrated again and again, the world of glass towers and flashing headlines demanding her return. She silenced it at last, turning the screen face down, and in that act felt a strange liberation, as though she were reclaiming a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. She listened instead to Olivia's stories, to Nathan's quiet humor, to the rhythm of a life she had never lived but suddenly longed to touch. It was healing, it was disarming, it was real. As the meal stretched into evening, Astrid confessed things she had never spoken aloud, that she had built empires but lost the simple joy of connection, that no one had ever looked at her with the kind of unconditional trust she saw in Olivia's eyes, that success had left her empty, her victories tasting of ash. Nathan listened without judgment, his gaze steady, his words gentle. "It's never too late to build something that matters." He said it simply, but the truth of it struck her deeper than any lecture or epiphany. She realized then that her wealth, her titles, her fortress of accomplishments had all been fragile shields against loneliness. The rain outside turned soft, the streets glistening under lamps. Olivia dozed against her father's shoulder, safe and warm, and Astrid found herself watching them with a longing she could neither name nor deny. When Nathan carried his daughter to the shuttle, Astrid followed with eyes that no longer judged, but sought quietly, hopefully, for a place in the orbit of their warmth. She whispered her thanks, not just for survival, but for the glimpse of something she thought she had lost forever. Nathan paused at the door, his smile faint but steady, his words carrying the healing weight of truth. Everyone's fighting something. The lucky ones have someone worth fighting for. Then he stepped into the night, carrying his child as though she were light itself. Astrid remained, her heels soaking in puddles, her heart heavy yet strangely free. She thought of the boardrooms waiting, of the headlines that would soon write his name, and for the first time she wondered if she had been climbing the wrong mountain all along. The rain whispered against her face, and in its gentle rhythm she felt the stirring of a new beginning, one not built on power or conquest, but on tenderness, trust, and the courage to be human again. And somewhere in the quiet space left behind, she knew this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something vast and healing, a love waiting to be discovered in the spaces between storms. The following morning, pale Irish sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the modest hotel room, painting the floor in streaks of gold that danced across worn carpet and quiet belongings. Olivia stirred first, her curls tousled, cheeks still flushed from dreams, and Nathan's steady hand brushed hair from her forehead as if the act alone could shield her from every shadow of the world. He had slept little, though not from unrest. His mind had been too full of the night before, the storm, the rescue, and the unexpected company that lingered in his memory like a soft echo. Astrid's laughter at that shabby restaurant still surprised him, fragile yet genuine, a sound that carried hints of a woman long hidden beneath steel armor and boardroom fire. When they stepped into the lobby later, Olivia clutching her sketchbook as faithfully as other children clutched dolls, Astrid was already there. She looked different in daylight. Her crimson silk had been replaced by something simpler, though still elegant, and her hair, once sculpted into perfection, now fell softer around her shoulders. The edges of power had not vanished, but they had softened, as though some healing part of her had decided it no longer needed to wound before it connected. She lifted her eyes when Nathan approached, and in them was no trace of the mockery from the day before, only quiet respect and something that trembled like the first touch of spring. They walked together toward the waiting shuttle, Olivia skipping slightly ahead, her small voice filling the air with descriptions of clouds she had drawn. Astrid listened, bending occasionally to hear better, smiling in ways that startled even herself. She had built an empire where smiles were weapons, carefully calculated, never freely given. But here, with a child, with this father who carried himself with grace instead of arrogance, her smile felt healing, unguarded, true. She wondered if they noticed how her heart beat faster, how her eyes softened each time Nathan's gaze met hers. The ride toward the airport was quiet, except for Olivia's chatter, yet it was the kind of silence that carried weight, not absence. Nathan watched the road, his profile steady, while Astrid studied him with new eyes. She saw the worn edges of his jacket and thought not of lack, but of endurance. She saw the calm strength in his hands and realized they were the same hands that had guided a plane through chaos, that had held his daughter's world steady when the sky itself had betrayed them. She had judged those hands as clumsy once. Now she could not look at them without feeling a pulse of reverence. At the terminal, media waited, their cameras sharp, voices urgent, hungry to capture the story of the anonymous hero. Nathan, however, guided Olivia gently through side corridors, avoiding the lights, choosing invisibility as deliberately as others chose fame. Astrid followed, almost without realizing, torn between admiration and confusion. She wanted to ask why he would not claim recognition, why he would not seize the moment that could have brought him wealth, comfort, 1,000 open doors. But each time the question rose, she looked at Olivia's trusting face and understood the answer without needing it spoken. When they paused for coffee before parting ways, Astrid finally let her guard fall a little more. She spoke of her childhood, of a father who had measured her worth in achievements, who had taught her to believe love was conditional, earned only by winning. She confessed, in a voice softer than Nathan had yet heard, that perhaps she had become him without realizing it, that she had built her company as if empires could fill the hollow spaces of the heart. Nathan listened in silence, not with the emptiness of someone waiting to respond, but with the fullness of someone willing to hold another's burdens quietly. His presence was healing in ways she could not yet explain, a reminder that not every listener seeks to solve. Sometimes they simply stay. Respect bloomed in places where disdain once lived. She had once seen him as a man fumbling with luggage in the wrong cabin. Now she saw him as a man who had carried more than luggage. He had carried grief, love, and the heavy responsibility of shaping a child's world. She saw the quiet choices he made daily, choices without applause, without headlines, and she realized that perhaps true greatness had never resided in boardrooms or portfolios, but in these steady, unremarkable acts of devotion. Olivia tugged Astrid's sleeve again, pulling her out of thought, showing her another drawing, a plane soaring above storms, coloured bright against grey clouds. Astrid traced the crayon lines with her fingertip, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice catching, and Olivia's answering grin broke something fragile open inside her. Respect deepened, not only for Nathan, but for the bond he had built with his daughter, a bond she realized she had never known in her own life. When their flights were finally called, Astrid hesitated, her heart battling with the weight of departure. She had never hesitated at airports before. Travel was routine, a blur of schedules and deals. But this time, leaving felt like tearing away from something essential. She wanted to remain, to follow, to keep the warmth she had found beside them. She turned to Nathan, searching his face for any sign, any invitation, and found instead his quiet, healing smile. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was an opening, a doorway to something that could grow. As she boarded her plane, her mind replayed his words from the night before. Everyone's fighting something. The lucky ones have someone worth fighting for. They echoed like scripture in her heart, healing her in ways ambition never had. She thought of her empire waiting, the meetings scheduled, the empire she had once believed was her purpose. And yet now, all she could see was a man in worn sneakers carrying his child. His strength measured not in conquests, but in love. And so respect transformed into realization. She had judged him and found herself wanting. She had mocked him and found herself humbled. And as the plane lifted once more into the sky, Astrid Sterling closed her eyes, her heart opening to the possibility that her life was only just beginning. The storm had passed, but the warmth it had left behind was healing her, guiding her toward a horizon she had never dared to imagine. The weeks that followed unfolded with the rhythm of ordinary life, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Nathan returned to his work in the hangar, hands stained with grease instead of gripping throttles, his heart steady in the simple healing ritual of keeping planes safe for strangers who would never know his name. Olivia skipped beside him on weekends, her laughter filling their modest apartment, her drawings multiplying on the refrigerator door until it looked less like a kitchen and more like an art gallery of skies and wings. He had promised himself that was enough. Quiet love, steady devotion, a life shaped not by medals but by bedtime stories. Yet the memory of Astrid lingered. Not the version that had mocked him on the flight, but the woman who had set her phone aside to listen to his daughter, the woman whose laughter had broken free in a shabby restaurant, the woman who had looked at him with something almost reverent when the storm had passed. He told himself it was nothing, a fleeting connection born of crisis. But sometimes, when the hangar grew silent at night and he wiped his hands clean under harsh fluorescent lights, her face returned to him like a warmth that refused to fade. For Astrid, life resumed in skyscrapers of glass and chrome, in conference rooms where every second was measured in profit and loss. She sat at the head of polished tables, her voice sharp as always, her commands executed without question. Yet behind the steel of her words, something had shifted. She found herself pausing, softening, remembering. When employees spoke of exhaustion, she saw not inefficiency, but the fragility of people who carried unseen burdens. She began to listen longer, to grant time off more freely, to measure her company's worth not only in revenue, but in the healing impact it could have on those who worked within its walls. Her colleagues noticed, so did the media, but none of their praise mattered to her as much as the quiet thought that perhaps somewhere a little girl with curls and crayons might approve. The gentle invitation that had bridged the worlds between them came again, unexpected and unassuming. One afternoon, as Astrid sorted through a mountain of messages, a small envelope arrived by ordinary post, its paper slightly bent, its ink uneven. She opened it to find a hand-drawn card, crayon clouds, a bright plane with smiling faces in the windows, and scrawled in a child's uneven letters, "Please come to my school play." Beneath it was a note in Nathan's handwriting, simple and steady. Olivia insisted. No pressure, but she'd be thrilled if you could make it. Astrid sat frozen, the card trembling slightly in her hands. She had received invitations to galas hosted by royalty, to summits with heads of state, to private dinners where fortunes shifted with a signature. None had moved her like this. The healing innocence of it undid her carefully built walls. She cleared her schedule without hesitation, something her assistant had never seen her do before, and booked a coach ticket, a first in over a decade. The auditorium was modest, filled with folding chairs and paper decorations strung by eager hands. Parents crowded the rows with cameras ready, their faces open with pride. Astrid, in simple clothes that made her nearly unrecognizable, sat quietly near the back. When the curtain rose and Olivia stepped forward in cardboard wings to play the part of a brave little airplane, Astrid felt her throat tighten. The child's voice rang clear and steady, speaking of flying, not with the strongest engines, but with the biggest heart. Nathan sat in the front row, his shoulders straight, his gaze full of a love so radiant it seemed to light the stage itself. When the play ended, the room erupted in applause. children ran into waiting arms. Cookies and juice boxes passed from hand to hand, laughter bubbling through the hall. Olivia spotted Astrid and ran toward her, tugging proudly at her hand to lead her to classmates. "This is the lady my daddy helped," she announced with innocent candor. "She needed friends, so I invited her." The words, unfiltered and pure, sliced through Astrid's heart, both wounding and healing at once. She wanted to protest, to hide, but Nathan's eyes met hers over his daughter's head, steady and kind, and something unspoken passed between them. He did not rescue her from the moment. He allowed her to stand in it, to feel it, to grow through it. Later, in the hum of the cafeteria where plastic cups clinked and children chattered, Astrid found herself standing beside Nathan once more. He thanked her softly for coming, his voice low, his gratitude sincere. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, her throat tight. "Thank you for reminding me what matters." He looked at her then, really looked, and in the silence between them bloomed an understanding that words could not capture. Respect had already been planted. Now, something tenderer began to take root. The gentle invitation extended beyond that evening. Coffee shared after practices. Occasional dinners where Olivia proudly set an extra plate. Walks through quiet parks where laughter mingled with falling leaves. Astrid discovered that love, when it came, did not announce itself with fireworks or conquest. It arrived softly, like sunlight spilling through curtains, like healing rain that nourished parched earth, like the quiet warmth of being seen for who you are and not what you have. She still returned to her towers, still commanded her empire, but now she carried different questions into those rooms. What would make this decision kinder? Whose life could this choice heal? Each time she saw Olivia's crayon card pinned above her desk, she remembered that strength was not domination, but devotion. And each time she met Nathan's eyes across a table worn smooth by shared meals, she felt her own edges soften, her heart opening to a possibility she had long abandoned, the possibility of love that did not demand, but simply gave. The storm had brought them together, but it was these gentle invitations, offered by a child's innocent hand and accepted by two wounded adults, that wove the fabric of something lasting. Healing came not in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency, in dinners of spaghetti, in laughter over misplaced crayons, in walks beneath skies that no longer threatened to break. And beneath it all, slowly, tenderly, love began to bloom, not as a sudden blaze, but as a steady flame that promised warmth for the storms yet to come. Evenings grew longer as autumn painted the town in shades of amber and rust, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke and the hush of leaves surrendering to the ground. Nathan and Astrid found themselves crossing paths more often, though never by accident. Each meeting had begun with Olivia's insistence, her gentle tug at Astrid's sleeve, her innocent declarations that friends should see each other often. Yet soon, neither Nathan nor Astrid needed the excuse of a child's invitation. Their worlds, once so far apart, now brushed against each other in quiet, healing rhythms, cups of coffee after school rehearsals, slow walks home beneath street lamps that glowed like guardians in the dusk. Evenings when laughter rose softly around a dinner table worn by use but made sacred by presence. It was in these ordinary moments that walls began to fall. Nathan spoke more openly than he had since Sarah's passing, his words halting at first, then flowing like a river once dammed too long. He told Astrid about the day he left the Air Force, the way his chest had ached when he hung up his uniform for the last time, the guilt that shadowed him even as he chose bedtime stories over briefings. He confessed how some nights he still woke with the echo of engines in his ears, his hands twitching as if reaching for controls that no longer answered. Astrid listened, her heart opening in silence, her respect deepening into something gentler. She had always admired bold declarations and victories won with force, but this quiet vulnerability felt more powerful than any conquest. In return, she offered pieces of her own truth, fragments she had buried beneath years of polished smiles and decisive tones. She spoke of her father's voice, always cold, always calculating, measuring her worth in report cards and later in profit margins. She admitted that she had built her empire not out of passion, but out of hunger, a desperate need to prove she could not be dismissed, that she was not fragile. "But fragility," Nathan said softly, his eyes steady on hers, "isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the place where healing begins." His words struck her with the force of revelation, not because they were new, but because no one had ever spoken them to her with such quiet conviction. Their conversations stretched into nights. In Nathan's modest apartment, where toys lay scattered and Olivia's drawings fluttered on the walls, Astrid discovered a kind of warmth she had never known. She had dined beneath chandeliers that glittered like constellations, but never had she felt more at home than beneath the simple light of his kitchen, where Olivia giggled over spaghetti strands, and Nathan's voice carried stories of skies she had never flown. She found herself laughing more easily, her shoulders lighter, her heart loosening from the tight fist of ambition. One evening, after Olivia had fallen asleep on the couch with crayons still clutched in her hand, Nathan and Astrid sat together in the hush of the living room. Rain tapped against the window, steady and soft, as though the night itself wished to soothe them. Nathan's gaze lingered on his daughter's peaceful face, and when he spoke, his voice carried both strength and trembling. "I promised Sarah I'd protect her," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm enough. If being here, fixing planes instead of flying them, is really what she needs." Astrid's hand, hesitant at first, found his. Her fingers brushed against his calloused palm, and she felt the truth of his life there, the labor, the sacrifices, the devotion. "She doesn't need a fighter pilot," Astrid murmured. "She needs you, the man who keeps his promises, the man who shows up every day, who listens, who loves. That's more than enough." Her words were not polished, not practiced, but they carried a healing honesty that made his shoulders ease, his breath steady. In that moment, she realized she was not only witnessing his vulnerability, she was being trusted with it. And trust, to her, felt more precious than any fortune she had ever built. In return, Nathan asked her the questions no one else dared. "What do you want, Astrid? Not the company, not the power. What does your heart want?" She had no answer at first. Years of boardroom battles had taught her to want what others envied: growth, wealth, recognition. But as she sat there, her hand still in his, watching Olivia dream on the couch, she felt something stir. A longing not for more, but for less, for simplicity, for love, for a place where she could lay down the armor and still be safe. Tears rose in her eyes, unbidden but healing, and Nathan did not look away. He let them fall, and when her voice finally broke through, it was soft and raw. "I want to matter, not for what I build, but for who I am." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes reflecting the warmth of understanding. "Then stop building walls," he said. "Start building bridges." His words, simple and steady, settled in her heart like seeds waiting to bloom. The weeks unfolded with more moments of shared vulnerability. Astrid learned to cook simple meals in Nathan's kitchen, burning the first attempts and laughing until her cheeks hurt, while Olivia clapped with delight. Nathan let her see his grief, not as a wound to be pitied, but as a scar that shaped the depth of his love. And slowly, Astrid began to show him her fears, the loneliness of empty penthouses, the exhaustion of always being the strongest voice in the room, the ache of wanting someone to see her not as a CEO, but as a woman capable of love and of healing. In these moments, romance did not blaze like wildfire. It unfolded like dawn, slow and steady, painting their days with warmth. Nathan would brush a stray curl from her face, his touch careful, reverent. Astrid would linger a little longer in his doorway after dinners, her eyes catching his in silences that spoke louder than any words, and Olivia, with the unfiltered wisdom of children, would look between them with knowing smiles, as if she had always understood that healing love could bloom where storms had once raged. As winter's breath began to whisper at the edges of autumn, their connection deepened into something neither could deny. It was no longer chance encounters or polite invitations. It was presence, consistent, chosen, cherished. Nathan and Astrid, once strangers divided by judgment, now stood together in the quiet, tender space of shared truths. And in that space they found not only each other, but themselves. The journey was far from over, but already they had learned this. Love was not the absence of wounds, but the courage to reveal them. Healing was not found in perfection, but in the willingness to be seen in all one's brokenness and still be embraced. And as they stepped forward into the unfolding story, their hands brushing, hearts opening, the horizon ahead shimmered not with storms, but with the promise of light. Winter arrived with its hush of snow and silver skies, and with it came a stillness that seemed to press pause on the frantic rhythm of the world. Streets glittered under lamplight, rooftops softened by frost, and the air itself felt like a whispered prayer, each breath carrying both chill and promise. Nathan and Astrid had grown accustomed to finding each other in the in-between moments of life, but now, as December unfolded, their connection deepened into something unmistakable. It was no longer coincidence. It was choice. Deliberate and tender, a transformation neither of them had expected, but both had begun to crave. Astrid visited more often, no longer as a guest, but as someone who belonged, even if she hadn't yet admitted it aloud. She arrived in coats far simpler than the designer armor she once wore, her hands full not of contracts or laptops, but of small gifts for Olivia. Crayons in new colors, storybooks that made her eyes widen with wonder. Nathan watched these gestures with quiet gratitude, his heart softening each time his daughter's laughter rang through the apartment. He saw Astrid not as the sharp CEO who had once mocked him, but as a woman slowly unlearning the language of walls and discovering instead the healing warmth of presence. For Astrid, the transformation was startling. She, who had once measured her days in deals closed and profits tallied, now found herself measuring time in smaller, gentler increments. The way Nathan's eyes crinkled when Olivia said something clever, the sound of pancakes sizzling on Saturday mornings, the sight of snowflakes caught in Nathan's hair as he carried groceries through the winter air. Each detail mattered in ways boardroom victories never had. She began to realize that power had never been about control. True power was this: the ability to love and be loved, to heal and be healed, to let herself be vulnerable and still be whole. One evening, the three of them decorated a small Christmas tree in Nathan's living room, its branches sparse but alive with laughter. Olivia insisted on hanging paper airplanes alongside the ornaments, each one folded with care and labelled in her handwriting. Astrid stood back at one point, watching Nathan lift his daughter so she could reach the highest branches, and her chest ached with a sweetness she hadn't known she could feel. This wasn't the life she had planned. It wasn't the empire she had built. But it was the life she suddenly realized she wanted. Healing had arrived in the shape of an ordinary evening, in the warmth of light reflected on glass, in the steady devotion of a man who had chosen love over ambition. Later that night, after Olivia had drifted to sleep beneath a blanket patterned with stars, Nathan and Astrid sat together on the couch, the glow of the tree casting shifting shadows across their faces. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, each heartbeat an unanswered question. Finally, Astrid spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of confession. "I don't recognize myself anymore," she whispered. "And for the first time, I don't want to. You've shown me something I didn't know I needed." Nathan turned toward her, his eyes steady, healing in their gentleness. "And what's that?" Her throat tightened, but she forced the words free. "That success isn't about building the tallest tower. It's about having someone to share the view with." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but they weren't born of grief. They were born of release, of years of holding too much, finally giving way to something softer. Nathan reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding, and for a long moment neither spoke. They didn't need to. The space between their hands carried all the truth they could not yet voice. From that evening forward, everything changed. Astrid began reshaping her company in ways that startled her colleagues. She created programs for single parents, insisted on humane working hours, redirected funds toward scholarships and shelters. She still commanded rooms with her sharp mind, but now her decisions carried a new language, the language of care, of healing, of remembering that behind every profit margin was a human life. She never announced why she changed, never explained, but Nathan knew. He saw it in her eyes each time she returned to the apartment, shedding the cold of boardrooms to step into the warmth of his world. And Nathan, too, was transformed. He had lived 3 years believing love was a chapter closed, his devotion reserved only for Olivia and the memory of Sarah. But as he watched Astrid move through his home, awkward at first, then natural as breath, he realized that his heart had begun to stretch again, making room for someone new. He felt it in the way his pulse quickened when their eyes met, in the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, in the way he caught himself hoping she would stay a little longer each night. The first time he kissed her, it wasn't planned. It happened in the quiet of another snowfall after he had walked her to her car. The air was sharp with cold, her breath rising in small clouds, and she stood there hesitating, as though torn between leaving and staying. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the soft light, and something in the stillness urged him forward. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but it carried within it all the unspoken truths that had grown between them. When they pulled back, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The warmth lingering on their lips said everything. From that night on, the transformation was complete. They were no longer two worlds colliding, but two hearts converging, reshaping themselves in tandem. Astrid still carried the sharp edges of her ambition, but now they were tempered by tenderness. Nathan still carried his grief, but now it was softened by hope. Together they built something new, neither her empire nor his solitude, but a shared life where love was both anchor and horizon. Olivia, wise in her innocence, declared one morning at breakfast, "You too smile more now." Nathan and Astrid laughed, exchanging a glance that held both gratitude and promise. It was true. Their smiles came easier, their hearts lighter. Healing had done its work quietly, transforming them not through grand gestures, but through the steady accumulation of trust, of presence, of love that grew like light, returning after a long night. And as the year turned, as snow melted into streams and days lengthened with the promise of spring, Nathan, Astrid, and Olivia stood together on a hill outside the city, watching planes cut across the sky. Nathan pointed them out, explaining wings and engines, while Olivia sketched with crayons, and Astrid leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance, no longer adversaries divided by judgment. They were a family in the making, bound by love's quiet, healing power, and by the courage to let their hearts be transformed. Spring blossomed with the gentleness of a promise kept, every branch touched by blossoms that seemed to whisper of renewal, every breeze scented with the tender fragrance of beginnings. The city stirred awake from its winter hush, and in its rhythm Nathan, Astrid, and Olivia discovered a life that no longer felt accidental but chosen, deliberate, stitched together by threads of love and healing. Nathan still spent his days in the hangar, sleeves rolled up, the smell of oil and steel clinging to him like an old companion. Yet he returned each evening not only to the laughter of his daughter, but to the warmth of Astrid's presence. Sometimes she waited for him at the door, her hair lit by sunset, her smile softer than the woman who had once measured worth in numbers. Sometimes she was in the kitchen with Olivia, flour dusting her sleeves, laughter spilling into the hallway as they shaped cookies into airplanes that never quite held their form, but always held their joy. For Astrid, the transformation of her heart was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way she lingered at playground benches, cheering Olivia's every cartwheel as though it were a victory greater than any corporate conquest. It showed in the way she turned down late-night meetings, her once unshakable calendar now bent to the rhythm of dinners, bedtime stories, and quiet walks under lamplight. She had not abandoned her empire, but she no longer let it consume her. Her colleagues whispered of change, of softness, of priorities rearranged, and though they did not understand, she did not need them to. Healing had taught her that true strength was not in walls built high, but in hearts opened wide. Nathan, too, carried new light within him. The grief that had once defined his nights was no longer a shadow, but a thread woven gently into the tapestry of his love for Sarah, now resting side by side with the love blooming for Astrid. He still spoke of his late wife sometimes, And when he did, Astrid listened with respect, never threatened, always grateful to know the roots of his devotion. And Nathan, in turn, honored Astrid's vulnerability, her confessions of loneliness, of mistakes made, of the hunger to be seen. Together, they became more than two scarred souls. They became a safe place for each other, a healing refuge, a home. Olivia, the quiet architect of this new beginning, thrived in the glow of their love. She would clasp Astrid's hand in one moment, Nathan's in the next, weaving them together with her innocent certainty that this was how life was meant to be. Her drawings shifted too, no longer just fighter jets and skies, but houses with three figures inside, smiling, their hands linked beneath rainbows. She carried them proudly to school, telling anyone who asked that her daddy had saved a plane and her friend Astrid had helped find her heart. Children understood better than adults sometimes, and her classmates nodded with solemn agreement, as if such miracles were perfectly ordinary. One evening in late spring, they returned to that same little restaurant near the airport, the one with fluorescent lights and paper menus, the one where walls first began to fall. The vinyl booths had grown no softer, the lighting no more flattering. Yet Astrid laughed when she sat down, the sound so natural it startled her. Nathan ordered spaghetti, Olivia demanded fries to demonstrate aerodynamics, and together they filled the small space with warmth that no luxury could ever replicate. Astrid looked around the room, remembering the loneliness she had carried into it months before, and marveled at how different the world appeared now that she was no longer walking through it alone. As the evening ended, Nathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers with quiet certainty. His voice was low, steady, healing in its honesty. "Astrid," he said, "I don't know where the road leads, but I know this. Life is better with you beside us." Her eyes shimmered, not with surprise but with recognition, as though she had been waiting her whole life to hear those words. She squeezed his hand back, her voice trembling but sure. "And I finally know what it means to build something that matters." The days that followed unfolded like pages of a story written in light. They celebrated small victories, Olivia's school awards, Nathan's projects completed, Astrid's foundations launched to support single parents. They faced challenges too, schedules that clashed, insecurities that lingered, nights when Nathan still woke with memories of storms, days when Astrid still wrestled with the shadows of her ambition. Yet through it all, they chose each other. Healing was not a destination, but a daily act, a promise renewed with every shared meal, every gentle word, every kiss, given not as conquest, but as comfort. In the quiet of their home, where laughter echoed against walls once silent, Astrid often found herself pausing, looking at Nathan reading bedtime stories, at Olivia drifting into dreams and realizing she had found what she once thought impossible. Not perfection, not power, but love. Ordinary and extraordinary, fragile and fierce, healing and whole. She had spent years climbing mountains of glass and steel, only to discover that the true summit was here, in a modest room filled with warmth, with trust, with the family she had never dared to imagine. The world outside continued its relentless pace. The story of Flight 789 had become a footnote in aviation history, a tale archived in training manuals and forgotten by headlines. But for Nathan, Astrid, and Olivia, it was the beginning of everything. A storm had broken open their lives, and from its wreckage they had built something unshakable. A love that healed, a family that endured, a future that glowed with possibility. And as another plane roared overhead one evening, its lights blinking against the darkening sky. Nathan lifted Olivia onto his shoulders, Astrid standing close beside him, their hands brushing in the twilight. Together they looked up, not with fear, but with wonder, their hearts steady, their love certain. The sky stretched endless above them, but they no longer needed to chase it. They had found their horizon here in each other. If this story touched something gentle in your heart, let its warmth keep flowing. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can continue to journey together through stories of love, healing, and hope. Your presence means more than words can hold, and every moment you spend here helps keep the light alive.